They dragged her through the snow in chains. Meredith Holloway, last of her family name, daughter of a man who'd spent 30 years building something honest in a dishonest valley, was thrown face first into the frozen mud of Redstone Crossing's town square, while every single person who had ever eaten at her father's table, borrowed his tools, or sheltered under his roof stood in the cold and looked at the ground. Every single one. Except him. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened next in that square changed everything for an entire valley. And if you're watching this right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees before sunrise. Meredith knew this not because she'd checked a thermometer, the one in the barn had cracked 2 winters back and she'd never gotten around to replacing it, but because she could feel it in the way her knuckles locked up when she tried to grip the fence post, and in the way her breath didn't just cloud in front of her face but hung there, thick and suspended, like it was too cold to move. She'd been up since 4. That wasn't unusual. Running the Holloway Ranch alone meant the hours before dawn were never really sleep hours anyway. They were the hours when she lay in her father's old bed, staring at the ceiling and running through everything that needed doing. The east fence line that had been sagging since October, the 2 heifers that were close to delivering and needed checking twice daily, the supply order she'd been putting off because the money wasn't quite there yet, but was almost there. Almost. Just another week or 2 of careful budgeting and she'd be fine. She was always almost fine. Her father, Edmund Holloway, had died 14 months ago, just as the first frost was settling over the valley. He'd gone quietly, the way he'd done most things. A long illness that he'd refused to name or complain about until it was too late for either of them to have any kind of real conversation about what came next. What she was left with was the ranch, 2,300 acres of high-grass land in the eastern cut of the Greymount Valley, and a sense of obligation so deeply embedded in her chest that she sometimes couldn't tell the difference between grief and duty. She'd been managing, barely, but managing, which was why, when she heard horses in the yard that morning, not 1 or 2 horses, the sound of a visitor or a neighbor passing through, but many horses, the deliberate rhythmic percussion of an organized group, she felt her stomach tighten before she even reached the window. There were 7 of them. 7 riders in the gray pre-dawn light, sitting their horses in a loose formation in front of her gate, and at the front, wrapped in a heavy wool coat with a silver watch chain glinting at his chest even in that dim hour, sat Deputy Calhoun Reeves. He was a broad man, the kind of broad that came not from labor, but from years of sitting behind desks and eating well, with a mustache that he groomed more carefully than most men groomed anything about themselves, and small, pale eyes that had never once, in Meredith's memory, looked at her or anyone else with anything resembling warmth. He was holding a document. Meredith pulled on her coat over her nightclothes, shoved her feet into her boots without bothering with the laces, and walked out to the gate. The cold hit her like a wall. She stopped 6 feet from the horses and looked up at Reeves without greeting him. "Meredith Holloway," he said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man reading from a script he'd rehearsed. "I am here to inform you that as of this morning, the property known as the Holloway Ranch, registered under Edmund Holloway in the county ledger of Greymount Valley, is subject to immediate seizure by order of Mayor Silas Voss and the Redstone Crossing Municipal Land Authority, in satisfaction of outstanding debt obligations totaling $4,260, unpaid and overdue." Meredith stared at him. "What debt?" she said. Not a question, a statement. Reeves shifted in his saddle. "The records are clear, Miss Holloway. My father paid every debt this family ever carried," she said. "I watched him do it. I was standing in Alderman Pruitt's office when he paid the last of the equipment loans 3 years ago. I have the receipt. The Municipal Land Authority's records indicate otherwise." "Then the Municipal Land Authority's records are wrong." Reeves tilted his head slightly, and there was something in the gesture, a microscopic adjustment, a careful neutrality, that told her he knew exactly how wrong those records were and had made his peace with that fact well before riding out here this morning. "You'll have the opportunity to present any documentation you believe is relevant," he said. "Mayor Voss has requested your presence in town, today." "Requested," she said. "I'd encourage you to think of it that way." She looked at the 7 riders. 3 of them she recognized, men who had worked for the county, legitimate enough in ordinary times. The other 4 she did not know, and they had the particular quality of men who were being paid more than a sheriff's deputy earned, which meant they were being paid for something other than keeping order. She went back inside and got dressed. Redstone Crossing in winter had a particular quality of silence that Meredith had grown up with and never entirely gotten used to. The town sat in a narrow cut between two ridgelines, which meant the wind came through in specific channels, howling down Main Street in one direction and then, inexplicably, doubling back. And in the deep cold of January, it had the effect of muffling sound so completely that you could sometimes walk from one end of town to the other and feel like you were the only person alive in it. Today, though, she was not alone. There were people on both sides of the street when Reeves led her in. Not a crowd exactly, more like an accumulation of individuals who had found reasons to be near their windows or standing in their doorways or pausing in whatever they'd been doing outside. She recognized most of them. Margaret Fitch from the dry goods store, who had known Meredith since she was 4 years old, and had given her peppermint sticks from the jar on the counter every Christmas without fail. Gideon Cole, who ran the livery, and who had shaken Edmund Holloway's hand at his funeral and said he was one of the finest men Greymount Valley had ever produced. The Prentice brothers, who farmed the land directly south of the Holloway property and had shared a fence line with her family for 20 years. None of them looked at her. Not Margaret Fitch, not Gideon Cole, not either of the Prentice brothers. Every single face she passed was angled away, down at the ground, up at the sky, turned toward a shop window with sudden intense interest in whatever happened to be displayed there. The silence was not the silence of indifference. She could feel the weight of it, the conscious effort behind it, the deliberate choice each person was making in real time not to meet her eyes. That was in some ways harder than the cold. Mayor Silas Voss was waiting in the square. He was a tall man, Voss, taller than people remembered when they thought about him later, because he had a quality of presence that made him seem larger than his actual dimensions, something in the way he held himself that communicated absolute certainty that whatever space he occupied was rightfully his. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, dressed with the studied elegance of a man who understood that power was partly costuming. He wore a dark coat with a fur collar and stood with his hands clasped behind his back in front of the old courthouse steps. Beside him stood his son, Preston Voss. Preston was 28 and looked like his father, the way a rough sketch looked like a finished painting. The basic shapes were there, but something essential was missing. Where Silas had a cold, organized intelligence, Preston had only temper. Where Silas projected control, Preston could barely sit still. He was standing now with his thumbs in his belt and a look on his face that Meredith had seen before on men who were enjoying something they had no business enjoying. There were more riders positioned around the square. She counted 9, armed. "Miss Holloway," Voss said. His voice was warm, which was the thing about him that had always been most dangerous. He sounded like someone's reasonable uncle. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't given much of a choice. We're all given choices." He smiled, and the smile didn't reach anything above his cheekbones. "I want you to understand that this is not a personal matter. The debt is a matter of record. The law requires me to act on it." "There is no debt," Meredith said. "My father settled every obligation this ranch carried. I can prove it." "The burden of proof is a complicated thing," Voss said pleasantly, "particularly when the records in question are the official records of this municipality." She understood then. Not for the first time. She'd been building toward this understanding for months, fitting pieces together slowly, the way you fit together a puzzle you don't want to finish because you don't like what the picture is going to be. But standing in the square with 9 armed men around her and every citizen in town looking at the ground, she understood it completely and without any remaining room for doubt. This was not about debt. This was about the land. "The railroad," she said. Something shifted in Voss's expression. It was small, barely perceptible, but she caught it. A fractional tightening around his eyes, the kind of micro-adjustment that a man makes when something surprises him and he refuses to let it show. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "The Eastern Corridor," she said. "That's what this is about. The survey route comes through the lower valley, through my land, through the Dunmore land, through the Carver homestead. You need all of it connected. You can't assemble the corridor with one property holding out." The square was very quiet. Voss looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she saw something that she had not quite expected. a kind of respect, cool and entirely without warmth, the way a man might briefly respect an opponent before eliminating them. "Seize her," he said. They put her in chains. Not metaphorical chains, actual iron manacles, the kind used for prisoners, cold and heavy and humiliating, locked around her wrists while Deputy Reeves watched with that same carefully maintained neutrality, and Preston Voss stood to the side with his arms crossed, smirking. She didn't fight it. There were too many of them, and fighting would have given them something to point to, some act of resistance they could use to justify whatever came next. She stood straight while they locked the chains and kept her eyes level and refused to give Preston the satisfaction of seeing her expression change. They walked her to the center of the square. The mud had frozen overnight and then thawed slightly in the early morning, so it was that particular consistency, partly solid, partly yielding, that gives way suddenly under pressure. When the rider nearest her nudged his horse forward and the animal's flank caught her shoulder, she went down hard, face first, her chained hands unable to catch herself properly. And the cold, gritty mud against her cheek and lips tasted like iron and dirt, and the particular humiliation of a situation you could not fix. She got to her knees. She was not going to lie on the ground. She was not going to do that. She got to her knees, and through the mud on her face she looked at the perimeter of the square, at the 20 or 30 people who had found reasons to be nearby and were now finding equally urgent reasons to look at their feet, their hands, the buildings behind her, anywhere but at her. Any documentation she has, Voss was saying to Reeves, is to be considered fraudulent pending review. She is to be held until she signs the transfer documents. "She won't sign," Preston said. He said it almost admiringly, the way someone remarks on a quality they find inconvenient but can't help noticing. "She'll sign," Voss said. "Everyone does." Meredith was looking at the edge of the square, at the gap between the hardware store and the telegraph office where the street opened up, and a man was standing, not in the crowd, not part of the assembled citizenry performing its collective act of not looking, but separate from it, standing at the edge of the space with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on her with an expression she hadn't seen on any face in this town in a long time. He was looking directly at her. He was watching. She didn't know him. He was somewhere in his middle years with the kind of face that comes from extended time outdoors. Angular and weathered, a few days of dark beard, eyes that had the particular quality of someone accustomed to reading distances. He wore mountain gear, heavy and practical, the kind worn by men who spent serious time in serious elevation. He had a rifle across his back and a long knife on his belt, and he was standing completely still in a way that was different from the stillness of the crowd, which was the stillness of avoidance. His was the stillness of assessment. He was looking at the chains, at the mud on her face, at the men around her. He was deciding something. Voss hadn't noticed him yet. Reeves was facing the other direction, organizing something with the riders. Preston was watching his father, waiting for direction. The stranger walked forward, not quickly, not in the way of someone charging into a situation or making a dramatic entrance. He walked the way a man walks when he has decided to do something and has decided also not to announce that decision to anyone in advance. He moved through the edge of the crowd with minimal disturbance, coming to a stop about 8 feet from Deputy Reeves. "Deputy?" he said. His voice was quiet, not soft exactly. It carried clearly in the cold air, but quiet in the way of a man who doesn't raise his voice because he's learned that speaking at normal volume in the right register gets more attention than shouting. Reeves turned, saw him, registered him as unfamiliar. "This is official county business, friend. I'd like to see the documentation for this seizure," the stranger said. "The actual documentation, signed order, legal basis, name of the presiding authority." Reeves blinked. "That's not something a civilian has standing to. Under territorial law, any citizen or present party may request to view official documentation being executed in a public space," the stranger said. "That's Article 14 of the Territorial Governance Code. I can be wrong about the article number, but I'm not wrong about the provision." He paused. "Are you?" There was a moment of pure, suspended quiet. Preston Voss stepped forward. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody in particular," the man said. He was looking at Reeves, not Preston. "The documentation, Deputy." Reeves looked at Voss. Voss's expression had gone flat in a way that Meredith recognized from her earlier exchange with him. The micro-adjustment, the calibration. He was reassessing. "Get him out of my square," Voss said. Two of the unfamiliar riders moved, and the stranger moved faster. What happened was difficult to reconstruct afterward, because it happened with the kind of economy that makes things seem slower than they are. He stepped inside the reach of the first rider as the man dismounted, locked the man's wrist with one hand, applied pressure to a specific point, and the rider made a short, sharp sound and sat down heavily in the mud. The second rider reached for his belt and the stranger caught his hand at the wrist before it completed the motion, turned his whole body in a single controlled pivot, and the man's arm was behind his back, and his own momentum was working against him before he'd fully processed what was happening. Neither confrontation took more than 4 seconds. The stranger stepped back. He had not raised his voice. He had not drawn a weapon. "The chains," he said to Reeves. "Remove them." Reeves was not a stupid man. He understood the calibration of a moment. He looked at the two men in the mud, at the riders who were watching with hands that hadn't quite reached their guns, at Voss, who was silent and calculating, and he understood that this moment had a specific fulcrum point and that the wrong move would topple something that couldn't be put back. "Now," the stranger said. Reeves removed the chains. They moved fast once the chains were off, not running, because running drew pursuit like blood drew wolves, but moving with purpose through the side street behind the telegraph office, and then into the narrower passage between the grain storage building and the alderman's old stable. Meredith's wrists were raw, and she was still tasting mud, and she had approximately 600 questions, but she held all of them because the quality of the stranger's movement communicated clearly that questions were for later. "There's a horse," he said, "gray, tied at the back of the livery, saddled." "Gideon Cole's livery?" "I made an arrangement this morning." He glanced back at her. "Can you ride hard?" "I grew up on a ranch." That wasn't the question. "Yes," she said, "I can ride hard." They came out behind the livery and the gray horse was there, tied and saddled, as he'd said. A solid-looking mountain animal with deep hindquarters and good feet. His own horse was beside it, a dark bay with the same mountain stock build, thick-necked and alert. She untied the gray and mounted before he'd finished checking the cinch on his own. Behind them, back in the direction of the square, she heard voices. Multiple voices. Voss's among them, the particular urgency of instructions being given to men on horses. A door slammed. Metal rang against metal. "North," the stranger said. He was mounted now and looking at her with those assessment eyes. "Straight north, through the willows, then follow the creek bed until it forks. Take the left fork. Don't stop and don't look back." "Those mountains," she said. "In January." "Yes, that's where you're taking me." "That's where you'll be alive," he said, "which seems worth considering." She looked back at the roofline of Redstone Crossing, her town, the town her father had helped build, that had looked at the ground while they put her in chains. And then she looked north, at the Greymount peaks rising gray and white and vast above the valley. And she made the decision that people make when all their careful, reasonable options have been stripped away. She rode. What? He said his name was Ronan Ashridge. He said it 2 hours into the ride, when they'd gained enough elevation that the town was invisible below them, and the timber had closed in thick enough that the sound of anyone following had either died out or was being swallowed by the trees. They'd stopped to water the horses at a thin creek running fast and black between ice-edged banks, and she was sitting on a rock with her hands wrapped in her coat sleeves because her wrists still ached, and he'd crouched beside the water and said without preamble, "Ronan Ashridge, mountain trapper. I've had a cabin in the upper range for 6 years. Meredith Holloway," she said, "but you probably knew that." I knew the name. He was watching the water. "I knew your father, a little. Crossed paths with him twice at the Redstone trading post. He never mentioned you." "No reason he would. We weren't close." He looked up at her. "He was a decent man, from what I could see." "He was." She paused. "Why did you step forward?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone formulating a diplomatic answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. "Because no one else was going to," he said. "That's not really a reason. It's the only reason I had." She looked at him, at the weathered face, The careful eyes, the set of his shoulders which communicated something she was still trying to read. He wasn't a young man's kind of reckless. Whatever he'd done in that square, he'd done it after some private calculation that she hadn't been party to. "You knew the law," she said. "Article 14. You knew it specifically. I know a lot of things from a long time ago." He stood, dusted his knees. "We need to keep moving. We've got maybe 2 more hours of good light, and the temperature's going to drop another 15 degrees after sundown." "Ashridge," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond to that directly. He just nodded once, a short, factual acknowledgement, and turned back to his horse. Petit. The cabin was not what she expected. She'd been imagining, through the last hour of riding in the dark, with the temperature doing exactly what he'd said it would do and her face going numb despite the scarf wrapped around it, something rough and improvised. A trapper's temporary structure, a lean-to with aspirations. What she found, at the end of a trail she could not have followed alone and would not have found again, was a low-built but solidly constructed cabin set back against a rock face, with a woodpile that represented weeks of serious labor stacked along one wall, and a structure that had clearly been maintained with the kind of ongoing attention that only someone who thought of a place as permanent applied to it. He had a stove, a real stove, cast iron, installed with a proper chimney. He had shelves, organized ones. She stood in the doorway while he got the fire going and looked at the interior with the particular attention of someone taking genuine inventory, because her circumstances required her to understand exactly where she was and what was available to her. "Sit down," he said without looking up from the stove. "Your lips are blue." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Sit down." She sat. He produced a tin cup of something hot, not coffee, some kind of brewed bark tea that tasted strongly of pine and not much else, and handed it to her without ceremony, and she wrapped her hands around it and felt some of the numbness begin to retreat. "They'll send riders," she said. "Yes. Into the mountains, in January. They'll try. The passes above 9,000 feet are closed this time of year. There are maybe 3 men in the valley who know the alternate routes." He paused. "I know all of them, and I know which ones to avoid." "You've thought about this?" He looked at her across the small space. "I've been thinking about Silas Voss for a while." The fire was catching now, and in the growing light she could see the cabin more clearly. And on the back shelf, a detail that hadn't registered in her first scan of the space, she could see papers. Not casual papers, not the accumulated correspondence of daily life, but papers organized with the kind of deliberate care that means something. "What is that?" she said. He followed her gaze to the shelf. His expression shifted slightly, a careful consideration happening behind his eyes. "That," he said after a moment, "is something we need to talk about." She set down the tin cup. "Then let's talk," she said. Buchste. The fire had been burning for an hour, and the cabin had moved from freezing to merely cold, to almost warm, when he brought the papers down from the shelf and spread them on the table between them. There were more than she'd initially seen, a substantial stack of them, some originals, some what appeared to be careful copies in a controlled, deliberate handwriting that she would learn over the following days was his. Land records, ledgers, correspondence, survey documents, the kind of paperwork that doesn't mean much in individual pieces, but assembled into a coherent whole begins to tell a story that its subjects would very much prefer not be told. "Your father sent me some of this," he said, 2 years before he died. She looked up. "He never told me. He didn't want you involved." He spread the pages carefully. "He told me, he said it in writing, and I have that letter, that he'd been building this for 3 years, collecting it. He knew what Voss was doing, and he knew it was too large to take to anyone local, because there wasn't anyone local who wasn't either employed by Voss directly or terrified of the consequences of crossing him." She was looking at the pages. Land transfer records, official ones, from the county ledger, dates stretching back 8 years, names she recognized. The Dunmore family, who had pulled up their homestead 5 years ago and left for reasons that had never been clearly explained. The Carvers, who had sold their land to a holding company whose name she didn't know. 3 separate parcels in the lower valley owned now by an entity called the Greymount Land and Resource Authority, which she had never heard of, whose board of directors, according to a document near the bottom of the stack, included a man named S. Voss as principal administrator. The railroad corridor, she said, 4,000 acres, assembled over 8 years through forced debt collection, forged records, and in at least 3 cases that your father documented. He paused, and his voice changed in a way she noticed but didn't comment on. Something worse than paperwork. She looked up at him. He documented murders, she said. He documented deaths that were reported as accidents or outlaw violence, with evidence suggesting they weren't. He was looking at the papers, not at her, and his jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with the information he was delivering and everything to do with something personal. He wasn't the only one who found those connections. The fire shifted and popped. "Someone you knew," she said. It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. He was quiet for a long moment. "My brother," he said. "Caleb. And his wife, May. 4 years ago, in the lower valley. Official report said they'd been caught in a raid by a band of outlaws moving through. No outlaws were ever caught. No credible witnesses were ever produced." He straightened one of the pages with his thumb. "Your father's records have a different account. A credible witness who gave a statement to Edmund in private because she was afraid to give it publicly. A description that matches 3 men known to work as private enforcers for the land authority." The cabin was very quiet except for the fire. "I'm sorry," Meredith said. "Yes." He said it simply, without performance. "So am I." She looked at the papers, at the weight of what they represented, the years of her father's careful private labor, the risk he'd taken and never told her about because he'd been trying to protect her from exactly what had happened this morning anyway. He was going to federal authorities, she said. That's what he was building toward. "Yes, he told me he'd made contact, that he had a name, a federal land agent named Hendricks, operating out of the territorial office, who had already indicated interest in what he had. And then your father got sick and the time ran out, and..." He stopped. "And then he died, and no one else knew," she said. "You know now." She looked at the papers, and then at the man across the table from her. This stranger, who had walked into a town square and refused to look away, and then led her up a mountain in January, and who had been sitting alone up here in the cold with her dead father's evidence and his own grief for 2 years, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. "We need copies," she said. "Multiple copies, complete ones." He looked at her. "That's going to take days." "Then we start tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "You understand what you're deciding," he said. "If we do this, if we put this in motion, Voss is going to come after us with everything he has. And he has quite a lot." "He was going to come after me regardless," she said. "He already had me in chains this morning." She looked at the papers. "My father spent 3 years building this. Your brother and his wife..." She stopped. "This doesn't stop unless someone makes it stop." He looked at her for a long moment with those assessment eyes, and then he got up and got a pen and a fresh sheet of paper from the shelf without another word, and sat down across from her, and they began. She did not sleep that night. Neither did he, as far as she could tell. They worked through the dark hours with the fire kept carefully banked, not so high that it risked the chimney betraying their position in the snow above, not so low that the ink froze in its bottle. And she learned, in those hours, that Ronan Ashridge was precise the way some people are only when something matters to them beyond description. His copies were exact. He caught her once, making a small error in transcription, a date written a year off, and corrected it without comment, quietly, the way someone corrects a thing because the thing being correct is what matters, not the act of correction. She learned he'd been a lawyer, not a practicing one, not for a long time. She found this out sideways from the way he handled the land transfer documents and spoke about territorial law, and when she asked directly, he confirmed it in the same minimal way he confirmed most things. "Long time ago," he said. "Back east." "What happened?" He was copying. He didn't look up. "Things went wrong," he said, "and then more things went wrong, and eventually I found that I preferred mountains to people." "And yet," she said. He glanced at her. "You walked into that square," she said. He looked back at his copying. "Yes," he said. "Well..." He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't push it. Outside, the snow had started again. She could hear it in the particular silence that settles when snow is falling heavily, a muffled, absorbed quiet that swallowed sound and made the cabin feel both smaller and safer than it probably was. Somewhere far below in the valley, she knew Silas Voss was making his own plans. She thought about the faces she'd passed in Redstone Crossing, Margaret Fitch's careful study of her own window display, the Prentice brothers' sudden fascination with the frozen ground, Gideon Cole, who had shaken her father's hand at his funeral and meant it, standing in his doorway and finding somewhere else to look. She didn't hate them. She wanted to and couldn't quite manage it because she understood in some cold, clear way exactly what kind of fear had produced that collective act of looking away. Voss had been systematic. He'd built not just power, but the infrastructure of fear, the kind of architecture that makes people understand, without needing to be told explicitly, that the cost of visible solidarity is higher than the cost of invisible cowardice. Her father had understood that, which was why he'd done his work quietly, in private, alone, over years. She thought about him in this cabin, at this table maybe, in the same chair she was sitting in, spreading out the same papers, talking to a man he barely knew because a man he barely knew was the only person he could trust. She reached for a fresh sheet and kept copying. The fire burned low and then lower, and outside the snow fell in the high silence of the Greymount peaks, and inside the cabin the pen scratched steadily across paper, building something out of nothing that might, if they were careful and lucky and stubborn enough, outlast every force arrayed against it. She didn't know yet about the men who would come. She didn't know yet what the mountains would demand of both of them before this was finished. She knew only that she was still alive, that the evidence was intact, and that somewhere in the valley below, in a town that had looked at the ground while she was dragged through its streets, the corruption her father had given his life trying to expose was still operating at full force. That had to change. She picked up her pen. The snow stopped sometime before dawn, but neither of them noticed the exact moment it happened because neither of them had been paying attention to the snow. By the time gray light began pressing through the single cabin window, they had produced 4 complete copies of Edmund Holloway's evidence, 4 identical packets, each containing transcribed land records, copied ledger entries, a handwritten summary of the witness account Ronan had received 2 years earlier, and a careful index that cross-referenced every forged debt claim against the original payment receipts Meredith had memorized well enough to reconstruct from memory. Her hands ached from the pen. The ink bottle had run dry twice, and Ronan had produced a second and then a third from the shelf without comment, as if he'd anticipated this. The original documents, her father's originals, the ones Edmund Holloway had assembled over 3 years of quiet, dangerous work, Ronan wrapped separately in oilskin and tied with cord, and placed in a tin box that he then slid under the floorboards beneath the wood stove. The 4 copies he distributed around the cabin, one behind the wall panel near the east window, one inside the lining of a canvas pack, one folded into the bottom of the grain sack, one that Meredith kept on her person, tucked into the inner pocket of her coat where it pressed warm and flat against her ribs. She held the last one out to him. "You should carry one," she said. "I have one." He nodded toward the pack. "I mean, on you, your body. If something happens and we get separated, nothing's going to happen," he said, and then stopped, and she could see him register his own words. The particular stupidity of saying nothing's going to happen when everything that had happened in the past 12 hours had been something happening. "Here," he said, and took the packet and put it in his coat. They ate breakfast in near silence. He had dried elk and hardtack and a tin of preserved peaches that had been there long enough that the lid had started to show rust at the seam. And he opened it anyway, and they ate the peaches over the hardtack because neither of them had slept, and sugar seemed relevant. She didn't ask how long the peaches had been there. They tasted fine. "Tell me about Caleb," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I've been reading your brother's name on these papers all night, and I don't know who he was. He's just a name on a document. He shouldn't be just a name on a document." Ronan looked at her across the table. The fire had burned to coals, and the cabin was in that morning state of faded warmth. Not cold yet, but not comfortable either, requiring a decision about whether to add wood. He didn't add wood. "He was younger than me by 6 years," he said. "Caleb, he was—" He stopped, started again in a different direction. "He was the kind of person who found things funny. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. He found genuinely funny things genuinely funny, which is rarer than it sounds. Most people find things funny to release tension or to make other people like them. Caleb laughed because something actually struck him as absurd, and he couldn't help it. She waited. He came west because I did. That was my fault, or at least I've thought of it that way for 4 years. He turned the tin cup in his hands. I came out here after things fell apart back east. He followed me a year later because that was just how he was. He followed me to things. He married May Derry, who was from a homesteading family in the lower valley, and they were building something. A real something. 40 acres, a small herd. May was expecting their first child when he stopped. When they were killed, Meredith said. Yes. She looked at the stack of completed papers between them. Your father's records have a different account, he'd told her last night. A witness. 3 names. The child, she said carefully. May was 7 months, he said. Yes. The fire shifted. He reached for the poker without getting up and adjusted a coal without looking at what he was doing. I left the law because I'd gotten very good at using it to help people who were already in positions of power protect themselves from people who weren't, he said. That seemed like a thing I should stop doing. I came out here and I trapped, and I lived in these mountains, and I told myself I was done with the machinery of systems and courts and documentation. He set the poker down. And then your father sent me a letter, and the letter had names in it, and one of the names was the name of a man who I believe ordered my brother killed. She looked at him directly. What's the name? He held her gaze. Terrence Holt. He's listed in your father's records as the operations manager for the Greymount Land and Resource Authority. He's the one who coordinates the enforcement side. Voss provides the legal cover and the political authority. Holt provides the men. He's still in the valley? He keeps an office in Redstone Crossing above the hardware store. A pause. I've walked past it many times. She understood what that cost him to say. The specificity of it. Many times, not once, not occasionally, but many times, the walking past and the not acting and the particular discipline that required in a man who had every reason in the world to act. You were waiting for the evidence to be complete enough, she said. I was waiting for something I couldn't do alone, he said. Your father understood that. He told me in his last letter, he said he'd thought about it, and the evidence alone wasn't enough without someone to carry it and someone to speak to it. A single man coming down from a mountain with documents is easy to discredit. A rancher with established ties to the land and a history in the valley, he looked at her. That's harder to dismiss. He was setting this up even when he was dying, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, the image of her father, sick and knowing it was serious, still thinking several moves ahead, still protecting her even while he was arranging for her to walk into the middle of something dangerous. He should have told me, she said, and the irritation in her voice surprised her a little. He should have trusted me with it. He said you'd say that. She looked at Ronan. He wrote it in the letter, he said. He said, if you're ever in a position to tell her about this, she'll be angry that I didn't tell her sooner. He said you were always braver than he wanted you to be. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her chest that she didn't have precise language for. Not quite grief, not quite gratitude. Somewhere in the region where those two things overlapped and became complicated. Smart man, she said finally. Yes, Ronan said. He was. Outside, the mountain was bright with new snow and entirely silent, the way high places get after a heavy fall when everything that was moving has stopped moving and the world has gone temporarily white and clean and without noise. It wouldn't last, but for that hour, it was absolute, and she was grateful for it. They spent the morning improving their situation. It was Ronan's word, improving, and she noticed the precision of it. Not fixing, not resolving, not solving. Improving, because that was what was actually possible. And he seemed to be a man who was precise about what was possible. He showed her the secondary exits from the cabin, a low door in the back wall that opened into a natural rock crevice and required crawling but emerged 50 yards up the slope in a stand of timber that couldn't be seen from the approach trail. And a third option that wasn't really an exit, but a hiding space beneath the floor large enough for a person to lie flat. He didn't present these options with drama or urgency. He presented them the way someone presents the location of the fire tools. This is where they are, now you know. She told him about the railroad contacts. She'd known about the railroad project for 6 months. Vague knowledge. The kind of information that circulates in a valley when there's a large project coming, arriving in fragments and incomplete versions through the network of people who talk to other people at trading posts and supply stores. She'd known there was a survey. She hadn't connected the survey to the systematic strangeness she'd observed in the valley. The Dunmores leaving without real explanation. The Carver sale that everyone said was voluntary and that May Carver's sister, talking to Meredith once at the dry goods store, had described with a look in her eyes that didn't match the word voluntary at all. She told Ronan this, and he listened in the focused way she was coming to recognize as his, not interrupting, not nodding unnecessarily, just receiving information and integrating it. That matches the timeline, he said when she was done. The survey was commissioned quietly 4 years ago. Your father pieced it together from the Public Land Office records, which Voss apparently didn't think to suppress because they seemed innocuous without context. He spread one of the maps they'd copied. The corridor runs here, through the lower valley, northeast, hitting the river crossing at Dunmore's old property, and then continuing through the eastern ridge to the main line junction at Calverton. 4,000 acres total, give or take. At current land values, worth maybe $60,000. At railroad-adjacent land values, once the line is confirmed, much more, she said. 3 to 5 times more, conservatively. She looked at the map. At the names of families whose land now sat in the column marked Greymount Land and Resource Authority. At the gap in the corridor where her own property sat, stubbornly unacquired, the reason she'd been dragged into a town square in chains that morning. There's a name my father mentioned, she said, in one of the letters he left. Not to you, to me, that I found after he died. I thought I understood it at the time, but I didn't. He wrote, "If it comes to the worst, find Hendricks in Calverton." He mentioned Hendricks to me as well, Ronan said, federal land agent. Your father believed he was operating independently of the territorial office, not a rogue, but someone who'd been specifically tasked with investigating irregularities in the Valley land records, and hadn't been able to make contact with any credible local sources because everyone was either compromised or frightened. We need to get to Calverton. Yes. That's 60 miles from here, and the main passes are closed. Yes. She looked at him. You said there were alternate routes. There are 3, he said. One is impassable in current conditions. It runs above the tree line for 4 miles, and with this fresh snow and the temperature, anyone on it would be visible from the valley floor for the entire stretch, and would also risk exposure. One is passable, but takes 8 days on horseback, and goes through territory where 2 of the men I'd expect Voss to send after us have family connections. He stopped. And the third, she said. The third is passable in about 4 days. It goes through the high timber on the north face, drops into the Sutter Valley on the other side, and comes out on the Calverton Road about 12 miles from town. What's wrong with it? Nothing's wrong with it exactly. He paused. It's difficult. The first day involves about 2,000 feet of elevation gain on trail that's going to be under 3 feet of fresh snow. The horses can do it, but it's going to be slow and hard on them, and they'll need rest at the top before we descend. When do we leave? He looked at her steadily. You understand we can't leave yet. We need to know what Voss is doing. We need to know if he's sent anyone up here and what route they're taking. Because going into that trail with riders behind us who know the mountains, how do we find that out? We're in a cabin at 9,000 feet. I have a contact, he said. He said it like the words had some personal cost. In town. Someone who owes me nothing, and I'd prefer to owe nothing too, but who knows what happens in Redstone Crossing about as well as anyone. Who? A woman named Dorothea Haynes. She runs the boarding house on Pine Street. She is not sympathetic to Voss. She's not unsympathetic either. She's careful the way people who survive difficult circumstances learn to be careful. But she and I have an arrangement that predates all of this. What kind of arrangement? She sends word up to the trading post at Ridgetop Station when she has information I'd want to know. Not often, twice in 6 years. He looked out the window at the bright white slope. I need to go down to Ridgetop Station today. It's 2 hours on horseback and I can be back before dark. You're leaving me here. I'm asking you to stay here. There's a difference. She considered this. No, she said. He looked at her. If you go alone and something happens to you, she started. If I take you and something happens, if you go alone and something happens, I'm a woman alone in a mountain cabin with 4 copies of evidence that I have no way to get to Calverton by myself because I don't know the route. She held his gaze. I go with you. The argument behind his eyes was visible, which she was beginning to understand was unusual for him. He was a man who kept his internal debates private as a rule, and the fact that this one showed meant it was more complicated than a simple tactical disagreement. You're right, he said finally. Get your coat. Ridgetop Station was not a town. It was 3 structures at the juncture of 2 mountain trails, a supply post, a small stable, and a structure that served as a combination saloon and bunkhouse, depending on the season. In January, it was primarily a bunkhouse, occupied by 2 elderly trappers who had not yet descended for winter, and a young man named Dewey, who seemed to perform some combination of maintenance and commerce, and whose exact age Meredith could not determine because he had the face of someone who had spent too much time at altitude without adequate sun protection. There was a message waiting. Dorothea Haynes had sent it up the previous afternoon with a rider. A short note, 2 sentences, written in the compressed code of someone who understood that notes could be read by unintended parties. Ronan read it twice and handed it to Meredith without comment. She read it. The first sentence said, Your friend from the valley asked after mountain roads this morning, seemed very interested in the North Face routes. The second sentence said, He brought company. 6 men I don't know, well armed, not local. Mercer, Ronan said. He was looking at the middle distance. Who's Mercer? Isaac Mercer. He's a detective. Private. Or he was the last I heard. Works for whoever pays him, but he has a reputation for doing it legally, or as legally as the situation allows. He folded the note carefully and put it in his coat. Voss is smarter than most people give him credit for. He's not just sending riders with guns. He sent someone who knows what to do with evidence even if he finds it. Can Mercer be reasoned with? Mercer can be reasoned with. Whether he'll listen to reason before he's fulfilled his contract is a different question. She looked at the note in his hand. 6 men she didn't know, well armed, North Face routes. He's already looking at the route you wanted to take, she said. Yes. So we can't go north. Not the way I planned. He was quiet, calculating something. There's another option. It's not a route I'd choose. The East Ridge, there's a high traverse that's passable in good conditions, extremely difficult in current conditions, that drops into the back country above Sutter Canyon. It adds 2 days to the journey, and there's a section above the tree line that... He stopped himself. That what? That isn't good, he said flatly. The exposure is significant, and there's a stretch of maybe a mile where if the wind comes up from the south, which it has a tendency to do in January, but it gets us to Calverton. If everything holds, yes. She thought of the copied papers inside her coat, the names on the land transfer records. Caleb Ashridge and May Derry listed in her father's notes as victims of orchestrated violence, their murders dressed up as something random and meaningless, and then filed away and forgotten. The faces in Redstone Crossing looking at the ground. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, first light. We need to rest the horses today and reprovision here. He paused. And I need to send a message back to Dorothea. What message? He was quiet for a moment. That we're alive. That the evidence exists. That if nothing is heard from us within 10 days, she should give a specific name and location to the first federal official who passes through Redstone Crossing. Meredith looked at him. It was the kind of contingency planning that a person only does when they have fully accepted the reality that the contingency might be needed. You think Mercer is going to find us before we get to Calverton, she said. I think Mercer is good at what he does, Ronan said. I think he's going to have those North Face routes covered quickly, and I think when he doesn't find us there, he's going to start working through the other options systematically. He's not going to catch us today. He might catch us on the East Ridge. She absorbed this. Then we make sure the evidence exists in more places than just our coat pockets, she said. Dorothea's message, can she be trusted with an actual copy? Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition. The same small recalibration she'd seen in Voss's face in the square, except where Voss's had been cold and calculating, Ronan's was something different. He was reassessing her, and not unfavorably. Yes, he said, she can. Then she gets a copy, and we identify one more person, just one, somewhere along the route to Calverton, who can hold a copy independently. She looked at him steadily. Voss can stop 2 people. He can stop 4 copies if he finds all 4 in one place. He cannot stop copies in 4 separate locations held by 4 separate people who don't know each other. Ronan Ashridge looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Your father said you were braver than he wanted you to be," he said. "I think he undersold it." She didn't respond to that. The afternoon was moving and there was work to do, and the East Ridge was going to require everything they had. But she filed the words away somewhere, in the part of herself that wasn't running contingency calculations or worrying about 6 armed men on a mountain, the part that still needed, occasionally, to hear that someone who had known her father thought she was worth something. She folded the note, got up, went to find Dewey about feed for the horses. The mountains outside were enormous and white and utterly indifferent, and somewhere down in the valley below the snow line, Isaac Mercer was working through his options with professional precision, and in his office above the hardware store, Terence Holt was having a conversation she would never hear about a woman and a man who needed to be found before they reached Calverton. The fire in the station stove burned steadily. She had 1 day to rest, 4 days of bad writing, and copies of the truth stitched into everything she owned. It would have to be enough. They left before first light. Ronan had them up at 4 in the morning with no ceremony about it. A hand on her shoulder. Her name said once at normal volume, and by the time she'd registered that she was awake, he was already at the stove with water heating. She'd slept in her clothes, which had seemed practical the night before, and proved to be, because the temperature inside the station had dropped to the point where her breath was visible, even with the banked coals still holding some heat. Dewey had the horses ready without being asked. She wasn't sure if Ronan had arranged this in advance, or if Dewey simply understood the rhythms of mountain departures. But both animals were saddled and fed when they came out into the dark, their breath making great plumes in the black cold, their feet shifting with the particular restlessness of horses that have been rested and are ready to move. "East Ridge Trail starts about a mile past the second creek crossing," Ronan said. He was checking the gray's cinch, not looking at her. "After that, it's single file until we clear the timber. Don't let the horse set his own pace on the uphill sections. He'll go too fast and blow out before we need him." "I know how to ride a horse uphill," she said. "I know you do." He straightened. "I'm saying it anyway." She didn't argue. She had noticed that his pre-departure instructions had a quality of compulsiveness about them, not because he doubted her specifically, but because saying things out loud was how he managed his own uncertainty about what was coming. She could respect that. They rode out of Ridgetop Station in darkness, so complete that she navigated entirely by the sound of his horse ahead of her, and the feel of the trail under her own animal's feet, and for the first 20 minutes neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were hooves on frozen ground and the occasional creak of leather and the vast, indifferent wind moving through the timber above. The first creek crossing was shallow, and she made it without incident, the gray stepping through the ice-edged water with careful, flat-footed deliberation. The second crossing was deeper, thigh-high on the horses, and she felt the cold through her boots despite the oilskin wrapping she'd put around them before they left. The particular bone-deep cold of mountain water in January that makes you understand very quickly that there are things in the world that do not care at all about your circumstances. They made the ridge trail as the sky was beginning to differentiate itself from the land. Not light yet, but the specific gray that comes before light, enough to see the outline of the slope above them and understand just how much of it there was. "That's what we're climbing," she said. "Yes. All of it. The traverse cuts across about 2/3 of the way up. It doesn't go to the top." "That's somewhat reassuring." "Only somewhat," he said, and she thought she detected something almost dry in his voice, which was the closest he'd come to humor since she'd met him. The climb took 6 hours. She would not remember it as a single continuous experience afterward, but as a series of discrete, difficult moments connected by a sustained physical effort that pushed both of them and the horses to the edge of what was manageable without crossing it. The snow was deep and uneven, 3 feet on the open sections, drifted to 6 and 7 feet in the natural channels where the wind had worked it overnight, and shallow enough in the exposed rock sections to be deceptive, hiding ice beneath a thin surface layer that the horses found with their feet before she could identify it visually. The gray stumbled twice. Both times she felt it through the whole length of her body. The sudden lurch and drop, and then the animal catching itself, scrambling, the terrible suspended second when she couldn't tell whether they were going to right or go over. And both times the horse found his feet and kept going. And both times she sat quietly for a moment afterward with her heart doing something irregular in her chest before she collected herself and moved on. Ronan ahead of her did not comment on the stumbles. He'd heard them. He'd half-turned both times, checking. She'd caught the motion, and when the horse recovered, he'd turned back and kept moving. She was grateful for the absence of commentary. At the traverse, they stopped. The trail ran along the face of the ridge at an angle that gave them, for the first time, a clear view down into the valley on their left and up along the exposed section ahead of them on their right. And what she saw in both directions required a moment of silent assessment. To the left, and far below, through a gap in the cloud cover that had been building since mid-morning, she could see the valley. Small from this height, a white and gray patchwork of snow and timber, and the dark line of the main road running through it. She could see Redstone Crossing, reduced by distance to a cluster of brown shapes in the white. She could not see individual people, could not see riders on roads, but the valley's scale from up here had the effect of making everything happening in it seem simultaneously more real and more manageable, as if the perspective itself was useful information. To the right was the exposed section of the traverse. It was a mile of trail running along the open face of the ridge with the mountain going up steeply on one side and dropping sharply on the other, and at this moment it was clear of cloud and she could see every foot of it. She could also see, because the fresh snow made it impossible to miss, that something had already been on it that morning. Tracks, single file, coming from the opposite direction, from the Calverton side, and stopping about a third of the way across the traverse before turning back. She looked at Ronan. "Someone came from the east this morning," she said. "Scouting," he said. He was studying the tracks with a stillness that she had come to recognize as serious concentration. They turned back. Could be the exposure. The wind on this face is punishing from the south, which it was this morning. Could be they saw what they needed and went back to report. Mercer. Or one of his. He looked at the tracks for another moment. The tracks are maybe 4 hours old. If they went back to report and then the party moved to intercept, he calculated something. We're ahead of them, but not by much. She looked at the traverse, the exposed mile of open face, the drop on the right side, the tracks of whoever had been there before them. "If we go across," she said, "and they're waiting on the other side, then we're in a difficult position. And if we don't go across, we go back. North face, if Mercer hasn't completely covered it, which at this point I wouldn't assume, or we go back to the cabin and wait, and hope the copies we left with Dorothea are enough." He looked at her. "What we don't do is nothing. The longer we wait on this ridge, the more the weather and the riders close in on us." She looked at the exposed section. The wind had picked up slightly in the last hour, not the punishing south wind he'd described, but present, moving, a reminder that conditions at this elevation changed on their own schedule without consulting anyone's plans. "Go," she said. He went first, which she appreciated not because she needed him to lead, but because his horse's passage would tell her what the footing was doing under the snow. She watched his bay move onto the traverse, careful, deliberate, the animal placing each foot with the attention of something that understood the drop on its right side, and she waited until he was 30 feet ahead before she followed. The exposure was not what frightened her. Heights had never particularly frightened her. What frightened her was the combination of variables, the horse under her, the footing she couldn't fully see, the wind coming in occasional unpredictable gusts from the west that pushed at her left shoulder with a force that was not catastrophic, but was not nothing either. And the knowledge that behind them, somewhere on this mountain, professional men were working through their options with the focused efficiency of people who did this for payment rather than survival. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead of her, and her weight balanced and her hands quiet on the reins, and she did not think about anything except the next 30 feet. They were 2/3 across when she heard the shot. It came from above, from the ridgeline above, and to the south. A single report that cracked across the open face of the mountain and then scattered into echoes that made it impossible to immediately locate. And for the first second, she didn't know if it had hit anything or anyone, because the first second after a shot is always a moment of pure informational chaos. Then Ronan's bay lurched to the left, and she understood. Not the horse. The horse was still moving, still upright. It hadn't been hit. But Ronan had pulled the animal hard left against the uphill slope, pressing them both into the mountain face, and he was shouting something back at her that the wind took, and she couldn't hear but the meaning of which she understood from the motion. Off the trail, into the rock, now. She pulled the gray left, and the horse resisted. A second of terrible resistance, the animal's instinct working against her instruction, the drop on the right side pressing into its awareness. And then she applied her leg firmly and made the decision for it, and the horse moved left, and they pressed into the shallow overhang of rock at the base of the ridge face, and she crouched low over the animal's neck and tried to understand what was happening. A second shot, this one closer, kicking up snow 6 feet to her right. "Ridge line," Ronan called. He was 30 feet ahead of her, pressed into the same overhang, his rifle out. She hadn't seen him draw it, but it was out, and he was reading the ridge above them with the focused attention of someone who knew how to do this. "Southeast, single shooter, maybe 200 yards. Can you—" "Not from here." He shifted, trying to get an angle. The rock cuts off the line of sight. She pressed flat against the mountain and thought with the particular clarity that comes when thinking slowly is not available as an option. One shooter on the ridge. Southeast, which meant above the traverse, which meant either Mercer's people had come up the ridge from the valley side overnight, or there was someone she hadn't accounted for who had known about the East Ridge route in advance. A third shot. High, wide, and then a fourth that was different, from a different direction, from below and to the east. And at the sound of it, Ronan made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. A short exhaled word that she thought was his brother's name, but might have been something else. And then he said very clearly, "There are 2 of them. One on the ridge, one below the traverse on the east side. They've bracketed us." She understood what bracketed meant. It meant no direction was safe. "Mercer?" she said. Mercer wouldn't shoot first. He'd call for surrender. His voice was controlled, but she could hear something working underneath it. Not panic, not exactly fear, the particular alertness of a man whose body has remembered something it learned a long time ago. "This is someone else." She thought about Dorothea's note. 6 men I don't know, well armed, not local. "Voss sent 2 groups," she said. "Yes." He was watching the ridgeline. "He sent Mercer to find us legally, and he sent someone else to make sure we didn't reach anyone to be legal with." Another shot from the ridge. She felt it hit the rock face 2 feet above her head, and the fragment that came off caught her cheek. Not deeply, a surface graze, but enough to sting sharply, and she put her hand to it and brought it away with blood on her fingers. "Meredith," Ronan's voice sharp. "I'm fine. It's nothing." "Are you sure?" "I said I'm fine." She pressed the back of her glove against her cheek. "Think. We can't go back. We can't go forward. And we can't stay here because they're going to improve their positions." "I know. So what do we do?" He was quiet for 10 seconds. Genuinely quiet. Not performing calm, but actually calculating. His eyes moving between the ridgeline above and the slope below, with the systematic attention of someone solving a geometry problem under time pressure. "There's a gully," he said, 40 feet ahead, on the uphill side. It cuts back into the rock face. It's not on any trail, but I know it's there because I've traversed this face before from the other direction. If we can get to it, we're out of the sight line from the ridge. 40 feet of open traverse. Yes. She looked at the 40 feet between them. Open snow, no cover. The slope dropping away on the right with nothing below it that she wanted to think about. "You go first," she said. "You're ahead of me. I'll go when you're in the gully." "The opposite," he said immediately. "You go. I'll draw their attention." "No." She said it flatly. "You're the one who knows where the gully is. If I go first and can't find it—" A 5th shot interrupted them. Ridge, south, and this one struck the ground directly in front of Ronan's horse, and the bay threw its head up and sidestepped sharply toward the drop, and he handled it one-handed with a control that required real horsemanship, getting the animal back against the rock without losing the rifle or going over the edge. "Fine," he said. His voice was level, but she could see what that had cost him in the set of his jaw. "Together. When I say move, move fast and don't stop for anything." She gathered the gray's reins, checked the packet inside her coat with one hand. Still there, still dry, still intact. The blood from her cheek was cold against her skin. "Ready," she said. He looked at her once. She didn't know what he was looking for or whether he found it, but he nodded. "Move," he said. She moved. The 40 feet was the longest distance she had ever covered on horseback. She knew it was probably 12 seconds. It felt structureless, outside of time, an experience in which every individual element, the horse's footfalls, the sound of shots that she stopped counting, the wind, the drop on her right, Ronan somewhere behind and to the left, was simultaneously crystal clear and completely irrelevant, because the only thing that mattered was forward, 40 feet, get to the gully, move. The gray hit the gully entrance at a scramble. The animal half-reared at the sudden drop into the cut, and she went with it instead of fighting, letting her weight shift back. And then the horse found the footing inside the gully, and she felt the rock walls close in on both sides, and she was in. Ronan came in 30 seconds later. His coat had a new tear at the left shoulder that hadn't been there before, and she looked at it, and he said, before she could ask, "Not deep. Leave it." They were in the gully, a narrow cut in the rock face, barely wide enough for the horses to stand single file, with the walls curving above them to block the sightline from the ridge. It was not a solution. It was a pause. "How long before they reposition?" she said. 10 minutes. Maybe 15 if they're being careful. He was looking at the gully walls, reading the rock. "There's a way up through here. It's not good, but it goes. If we can get above the ridge shooter, above his position, the geometry changes entirely." She thought about what was behind them, what was ahead. 6 men Dorothea didn't know. Preston Voss somewhere in the valley, waiting for a report that they'd been found and stopped. The evidence in her coat, the evidence in Ronan's coat, the copies distributed to Dorothea, and the one they'd left at Ridgetop Station with Dewey, who she prayed would be overlooked as too minor a figure to bother with. "How long to get through the gully to above the ridge?" she said. 20 minutes if we leave the horses." "We leave the horses," she said immediately. He looked at her. "If we leave the horses and this doesn't work, if we leave the horses and it does work, we deal with the horses later. The evidence doesn't need a horse. It needs us to be alive and moving." She held his gaze. 20 minutes? "Approximately." "Then let's go." They secured the horses to the best anchor available in the gully, a narrow rock spike that would hold if the animals didn't panic and pull in opposite directions, which she acknowledged was not guaranteed but was the best option available. And they went up through the gully on foot, and it was not good, as he had said, because good was not a category that applied to anything happening above 9,000 feet on an exposed mountain face in January, with men below and above who wanted to stop them from existing. The gully was icy below the surface snow, and her hands found holds that held and holds that did not. And she learned the difference quickly and without ceremony. Her cheek was still bleeding, slowly, and the cold was doing something to her left foot that she was refusing to assess because assessment would require stopping, and stopping was not available. Ronan was above her, pulling himself through the same rock, and once he reached back and grabbed her wrist when she slipped, and for a moment all of her weight was on his grip, and she could feel the strain in it, and then her feet found purchase, and the moment passed. 19 minutes after they entered the gully, they came out above the ridge line. The ridge shooter was 20 yards away, repositioning as Ronan had predicted, moving along the top of the ridge to find a new angle on the gully entrance. He hadn't looked up. That was his error. Not looking up, not accounting for the possibility that his targets might come out above rather than retreat below. Ronan moved before she'd fully processed the situation. He came across the ridgetop fast and low, and the shooter turned at the sound. And Ronan hit him with his shoulder in a controlled collision that took them both to the snow. And it was brief and ugly and not clean in any of the ways that violence in stories is presented as clean, but it ended with Ronan on his feet and the shooter face down in the snow, alive, with his rifle 10 feet away and his hands pulled behind him with a length of cord from Ronan's coat that she hadn't known was there. She stood at the top of the gully, breathing hard, her hands raw from the rock, her cheeks still bleeding, looking at this. "Who sent you?" Ronan said. He was standing over the man, not winded in any visible way that she could see, though she knew from the climb that he had to be. The man on the ground said nothing. "Holt," Ronan said. It wasn't a question. "You work for Holt." A slight shift in this man's shoulders. Not a confirmation exactly, but the particular non-denial of someone whose face has given up what his mouth won't. Ronan crouched down to the man's level. His voice was entirely flat. "Where's the other shooter?" "Go to hell," the man said. Already there, Ronan said. Where is he? The wind came across the ridge top, and Meredith felt it in every part of her body that was wet or exposed or cold, which was most of her body. Below them, somewhere on the eastern face of the mountain, the second shooter was out of sight but not out of range. She understood that standing on an open ridgetop was not a sustainable position, regardless of what this man on the ground told them or didn't tell them. She crouched beside the man, across from Ronan. "We're not going to hurt you further," she said. "Not warm, not threatening, just factual. But we're also not going to be here much longer, and when we leave you're going to be tied up on this ridge at this temperature. There's a trading station 2 miles west called Ridgetop. Tell me where the second shooter is, and I'll tell you how to get to it after we untie your hands." The man looked at her, at the blood on her cheek, at her coat, at whatever it was he saw in her face. "Below the traverse," he said. "East end. There's a rock formation, looks like a split tooth. He's behind the right side." She stood, looked at Ronan. He was already looking back at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not surprise exactly, more the particular acknowledgement of someone watching a thing done well. They untied the man's hands, left him the directions to Ridgetop, and took his rifle. The second shooter, when they came down off the ridge from the eastern approach, found himself suddenly above his own position rather than below his targets, and the reversal of advantage was sufficient to end the engagement without additional violence. He sat down in the snow when Ronan appeared on the rock above him, and he answered their questions with the particular speed of a man who has recalculated his options and found them limited. He worked for Holt. He didn't know who Mercer was. He'd been told to prevent 2 people from reaching Calverton with no particular instruction about method. They left him his weapon and took his ammunition and left him with the location of Ridgetop Station, and they went back into the gully and got the horses, which had not panicked, and they came out onto the eastern face of the ridge as the afternoon light was starting its winter descent toward the short horizon. She was cold in a way that had gone past discomfort into a more neutral territory. Her body had passed judgment and was now simply functioning, processing information without the overlay of complaint. Her cheek had stopped bleeding. Her left foot was back, which was a relief. Ronan, riding beside her now that the trail had widened enough to allow it, said nothing for a long time. Then, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "That man on the ridge," he said. "He was one of the 3 men named in your father's witness account, the account of Caleb and May's deaths." She held his gaze. "You knew that," she said. "I recognized him when I got close enough." His voice was entirely controlled. "I've had his description for 2 years. And you still let him go?" "Yes." She looked ahead at the trail, at the eastern face of the mountain dropping into the back country below them, the distant Calverton road a thin brown line in the snow. "Ronan," she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say." She looked at him directly. "I was going to say, I know what that cost you, and I think it was right." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have agreed with you," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "He would have." The horses moved steadily down the eastern slope, and behind them the ridge was silent, and ahead of them Calverton was still 2 days away, but was closer than it had been that morning, and the copies of the evidence were still dry and still intact, and still distributed across enough separate locations and separate people that no single act of violence could erase them. That was what mattered. She let the horse find his pace on the downhill, and she watched the country opening up ahead of her, and she did not let herself think about Isaac Mercer, still somewhere on this mountain, still working through his options with professional precision, the north face routes covered, 6 men positioned, a contract to fulfill. There was still enough day left to use. They came down out of the mountains on the second evening, not dramatically, not in the way stories sometimes arrange arrivals, with the light catching everything at the right angle and the destination appearing suddenly whole and welcoming below. They came down through timber that thinned gradually into scrub and then into the dead winter grass of the lower elevation, cold and sore, and running on the particular fuel that isn't energy exactly, but is what the body produces when energy is gone and stopping still isn't an option. The horses were spent. The gray had developed a slight favoring of his left foreleg sometime in the afternoon that Meredith monitored with the constant peripheral attention of someone who understands that a horse that goes lame on open ground in January is a serious problem, not an inconvenience. He hadn't gone lame. He was tired, and the footing had been punishing, and he was telling her about it, which she appreciated as honest communication between a horse and the person asking things of him. The Calverton road appeared below them as a brown line in the fading light, and she felt something release in her chest at the sight of it that she hadn't fully known was held tight until it let go. "How far to town?" she said. 8 miles. Maybe 9. Ronan was looking at the road, reading it the way he read most things, checking it before committing to it. "There's a farm about 2 miles down. Elias Prout. He's not connected to anyone in the valley. I stayed there once 3 years ago, during a bad storm coming through." "Can he be trusted?" "He's 73 years old and hasn't been to Redstone Crossing in 5 years because the road bothers his back," Ronan said. "He doesn't know Voss personally and doesn't care about valley politics. He'll give us a place to sleep and he won't ask more than he needs to know." She looked at the gray's left leg. "We need the horses rested before we go into Calverton." "Yes." "Then Prout's farm." They rode down to the road in the last of the light and turned east, and the gray's gait evened out slightly on the flat ground, which she took as a good sign and didn't examine too closely, because sometimes good signs are all you have, and examining them too hard makes them disappear. Elias Prout turned out to be a small, extremely deliberate man who answered the door with a lamp in one hand and a look on his face that was neither alarmed nor particularly surprised, as if visitors arriving out of the mountains at nightfall in January were unremarkable in his experience. He looked at Ronan, then at Meredith, then at the horses behind them, then back at Ronan. "Your face looks worse than last time," he said to Ronan. "It's been a harder winter," Ronan said. Prout looked at the cut on Meredith's cheek, which had closed but was visible in the lamplight as a dark line from cheekbone toward jaw. He didn't comment on it. He stepped back from the door. "Barn's open," he said. "I'll put something on the stove." He fed them without asking their business, a thick beef stew that had been cooking long enough that the meat fell apart at a look, and bread that was 2 days old but was bread, which after 4 days of hardtack and dried elk was sufficient to make her briefly close her eyes in something close to gratitude. He talked about his cattle operation, about the winter, about a dispute with his neighbor over a fence line that had been ongoing for 11 years and showed no signs of resolution, and Meredith listened to all of it with genuine attention because the ordinary domestic texture of another person's life was, at that moment, the most calming thing she could have been given. After dinner, Prout produced a bottle of something amber and poured 3 glasses without asking, and they sat by his fire, and Ronan said, without preamble, "We need to leave a package with you. We'll collect it or send someone to collect it. If no one comes within 30 days, I need you to take it to the Federal Land Office in Calverton and give it directly to the land agent, not to the clerk, to the agent personally. His name is Hendricks." Prout looked at his glass. "This package going to bring trouble to my door?" "Possibly," Ronan said. "I won't lie to you about that." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from people who don't want certain documents seen by federal authorities." Prout considered this for a long time, in the unhurried way of a man who has reached an age where he moves through decisions at his own pace and other people's urgency is their own problem. "Edmund Holloway's daughter," he said. He was looking at Meredith. She was surprised enough that it showed. "You knew my father?" "Met him twice, trading post, years back. He was a straight man." A pause. "This about what he was working on?" She looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Prout. "How do you know about that?" Ronan said. "He mentioned it, obliquely. Said he'd found some things in the county records that concerned him and he was being careful about who he talked to." Prout set down his glass. "I told him I was too old to be involved in valley politics. He said that was fine. He said he just needed someone outside the valley who could hold a letter if it came to that." He looked at the fire. "He never sent the letter." "He died before he could," Meredith said. "Yes, I figured." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll hold your package." She got the copy from her coat, the one she'd been carrying against her ribs for 4 days, slightly curved from the warmth of her body, and the oilskin wrapping damp at the edges, but the contents perfectly intact. And she set it on the table. Prout looked at it, but didn't touch it. 30 days, he said. 30 days, Ronan confirmed. They slept that night in Prout's spare room, which had 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out on the dark barn roof and the stars above it. And she was asleep before she'd finished thinking about being asleep, gone between one breath and the next without any transition she was aware of. She woke in the gray pre-dawn to the sound of Ronan moving in the other bed. Not up, just shifting. The particular restlessness of a person whose body is tired but whose mind won't quite let go. "You're not sleeping," she said. A pause. "Observant." "Mercer," she said. Not a question. "He's still up there," Ronan said. "We came down the east face. He's covering the north face routes. Eventually, he figures out we went east. He's good enough to figure it out quickly." "How long?" "He'll know by tomorrow morning that we're not in the mountains anymore. He has enough men to have someone watching the Calverton Road." A pause. "He might already be in Calverton." She lay in the dark and thought about this. "Then we need to get to Hendricks before Mercer gets to us." "Yes." "Do you know where Hendricks is?" "Physically. His office, where he works." "The Federal Land Office is on Commerce Street. I know the building." He paused. "I don't know Hendricks personally. Your father did, by correspondence. I have the letter that names him, but I've never met the man." She thought about the copies. Prout's copy, Dorothea's copy in Redstone Crossing, the copy at Ridgetop with Dewey, the one Ronan still had in his coat. 3 independent locations, and the original still under the cabin floorboards. "If Mercer stops us before we reach Hendricks," she said, "the other copies still exist." "Yes. But copies without a principal witness to present them and speak to their provenance." He stopped. "Your father understood this. That's why he needed you specifically. A rancher whose family land is directly affected, who can speak to the history of the Holloway property and the payment of debts, who was physically dragged into a public square by the mayor. That's not the same as anonymous documents arriving at a federal office." She understood what he was saying. The evidence without a person behind it was a stack of paper. The person without the evidence was an unverifiable complaint. They needed both, together, in the same room as Hendricks. "Then we get to Hendricks first," she said. In the morning, Prout let them take fresh horses. A practical arrangement, not a gift, he made clear. He wanted their horses rested and returned when they were done, and he wanted the gray's left foreleg looked at by his hand. Who knew horses? She didn't argue with any of this. The practical arrangement of a clear-eyed old man was its own form of reliability. They rode into Calverton as the town was coming to its mid-morning activity. Not a large town, but a real one. A territorial hub with a proper main street and a functioning commercial district, and most importantly, a federal presence in the form of the land office building on Commerce Street, which was brick, 2 stories, with a territorial seal above the door that she noticed from half a block away and felt something complicated at the sight of. "Slow down," Ronan said quietly. She realized she'd been pushing the horse forward without meaning to. They came in at a walk, unhurried, and she made herself look at the street around them the way Ronan had taught her over 4 days of mountain travel. Not at what she was looking for, but at everything, letting her peripheral attention catch what direct attention missed. There was a man outside the general store who had the particular quality of stillness she'd learned to recognize. Not the stillness of someone waiting for a friend or resting from an errand, but the specific watchful stillness of someone positioned. He was looking at the street from a spot that gave him sight lines in 3 directions. He hadn't looked at them yet. "He's here," she said. "I see him," Ronan said. "There'll be another one, probably near the land office." She thought through their options in the time it took to ride half a block. Go around. But Calverton's grid was simple enough that going around only delayed the approach. It didn't change the fundamental problem. Go straight. But walking into a building with Mercer's man at the door was a certain way to get stopped before they reached Hendricks. "Go somewhere else first." "The telegraph office," she said. Ronan glanced at her. "Before we go to Hendricks," she said, "we send a telegram to the territorial office, not Hendricks specifically, the main land administration office. We say we have documentary evidence of an 8-year land fraud scheme in Greymount Valley, that we are attempting to deliver that evidence to Federal Agent Hendricks in Calverton, and that we request confirmation that the evidence will be received and that the delivering parties will be protected under territorial law. That gives Mercer's people time to— It also creates a record," she said, "that we were here, that we attempted to deliver the evidence, that we contacted the territorial office directly. If something happens to us after that telegram is sent, the territorial office has a record of why and from whom. That changes Mercer's calculation." She looked at him. It changes Voss's calculation, too. Ronan was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. The telegram office is on the next block, he said. If Mercer's man at the general store is the only one on this end of the street. He's not, she said. But we walk like people who belong here, and we go directly to the telegraph office, and we don't stop. They tied the horses at the post in front of the feed store, a location that required walking past the man outside the general store, who looked at them with a professional blankness that confirmed what she already knew and then looked away. She didn't hurry. She walked at the pace of someone with ordinary business to conduct. The telegraph office was warm and smelled of kerosene, and the operator was a young woman with red hair and ink-stained fingers who looked up when they came in and said, "Help you?" in the tone of someone who processed 60 messages a day and had reduced the work to a cheerful efficiency. Meredith dictated the telegram. She kept it factual and specific. Names, the nature of the evidence, the land fraud scheme's scope, the request for formal reception and protection under territorial law. The operator wrote it down without visible reaction, though Meredith noticed the slight pause when she said Silas Voss's name. Not quite recognition, but the quality of someone filing a name away is notable. To the Territorial Land Administration in the capital, Meredith said, and a copy to the Federal Land Office on Commerce Street, addressed personally to Agent Hendricks. That's 2 separate sends, the operator said. Yes, she named the price. Meredith paid it with the last of the cash she had from the cabin. Ronan had pressed it on her before they left Ridgetop, an envelope of folded bills he kept behind the flour sack, his emergency fund, which he'd handed her without ceremony and told her to keep separate from his person in case they were separated. 15 minutes, the operator said. They waited. Ronan stood near the window, not watching the street directly, watching it in reflection in the glass. She sat on the wooden bench and kept her hand still in her lap and thought about her father dictating his own careful correspondences over 3 years, building his case in the same patient, deliberate way, alone. Not alone, she corrected herself. He'd had Ronan, he just hadn't told her. The operator confirmed both sends. They came back out onto the street and Ronan said quietly, "He's moved. The man from the general store. He's 20 yards north of where he was. He followed us. He noted us. There's a difference for now." He looked at her. Land office, straight line. She nodded. They were half a block from the land office when Isaac Mercer stepped out of the alley beside the milliner's shop. She'd been imagining Mercer in a general way since Dorothea's note. A capable man, professionally dangerous, contractually focused. What she hadn't quite imagined was the specific quality of him. A compact, gray-haired man in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that was functional rather than showy, with the face of someone who had spent 30 years watching other people make decisions under pressure and had drawn particular conclusions from that observation. He looked at them with an expression that was neither hostile nor warm. It was precise. He was evaluating, the way a skilled tradesman evaluates a problem before addressing it. He was not holding a weapon. He said, "Miss Holloway, Mr. Ashridge." A pause. "I've been looking for you for 4 days." "We know," Meredith said. "I'd like you to come with me to—" "We're going to the land office," she said, "to Agent Hendricks. You can come if you'd like. We sent a telegram to the Territorial Administration 11 minutes ago, so there's a record of where we are and why. We'd be glad to have a witness." Something moved in Mercer's expression. Not quite surprise, but the slight recalibration of someone whose anticipated conversation has started differently than expected. "I have a contract," he said. "With Silas Voss," Ronan said. "Yes, then you have a contract with a man who, if the evidence we're about to deliver to Hendricks holds up, and it will hold up, is going to be arrested by federal authorities within the week." Ronan's voice was entirely flat, the lawyer's voice she'd heard before, the one he kept stored separately from everything else. "At that point, your contract is worthless, and your position is that of a man who was hired by a criminal to intercept material witnesses. That's not a position I'd want to be in." Mercer looked at him, at Meredith, at the land office building half a block away. He said, "What does the evidence consist of? 8 years of forged debt records, false land transfers, documented witness accounts of murders staged as accidents, and a complete financial record of the Greymount Land and Resource Authority and its relationship to the Railroad Corridor Survey." She held his gaze. 3 independent copies in 3 separate locations outside the valley, held by 3 separate individuals. The originals are in a 4th location. 1 copy is in Agent Hendrix's hands in about 4 minutes. A long pause. "I'd like to review the evidence before you present it," Mercer said. "No," she said. "Miss Holloway, you were hired to stop us," she said. "I'm not going to give you the opportunity to assess whether stopping us is still in your interest before we're in that building. When we're in that building and the evidence is in Hendrix's hands, you're welcome to review everything we have." She looked at him steadily. "But you're not going to delay us. Not today." Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a problem." Something in his voice changed. A small, significant change. A quality that hadn't been there before. She looked at him more carefully. "Preston Voss is in this town," Mercer said. "He followed me here. He didn't tell his father he was coming, as far as I can determine, which means he's not here on official business." He paused. "He has 2 men with him, not mine, his own men, separate from the ones his father hired through Holt." The name Holt landed with weight. The operations manager, the man Ronan had been carrying for 4 years. "Preston's not here to watch the evidence get delivered," Ronan said. "No," Mercer said. "He's not." She looked at Ronan. He was looking at the street behind Mercer, already reading it. "He's going to try to kill us," she said. Not a question. "Not stop us. Kill us. Destroy the copies we have and deal with the fallout from the other copies later." She understood this with a cold clarity. Because Preston is 28 years old and afraid, and this is his family's empire, and he can't think 3 moves ahead the way his father can. "That's my assessment," Mercer said. She looked at Mercer directly. "You didn't have to tell us that." "No," he said. "I didn't." She understood what he was doing. He was choosing, not dramatically, not with any announcement of his choice, just choosing, in the particular way that people choose things when they're in the middle of a situation and the calculation has shifted and they've had enough experience to know which side of the shift they want to be on. "Come with us," she said. He fell in beside them. They were 30 feet from the land office door when she heard Preston Voss's voice from the cross street to their right. She didn't catch the words. She heard the tone, the particular pitch of a young man running on anger and inheritance, and a desperation that had never learned the discipline his father's cold intelligence imposed. And she heard the sound of men moving fast on the frozen ground. And then things happened quickly and not cleanly, the way things happen in real life when they go wrong. Preston's 2 men coming around the corner at a run, Mercer turning and doing something precise and controlled that stopped the first one before he'd fully processed what was happening, Ronan moving left toward the second, and Preston himself appearing at the corner of the cross street with a pistol in his hand that he was raising at nobody specifically and everybody in general, his face showing every year of resentment and fear and the particular damage done to people who grow up in their father's shadow and can't figure out how to be anything else. She walked toward him. It was not a brave decision. She would think about this later, and what she'd conclude was that it wasn't bravery so much as the recognition that standing still was worse, and moving backward was worse, and Ronan was occupied, and Mercer was occupied, and there was Preston Voss with a gun pointed at the space she occupied, and so she walked toward him. "Preston," she said. Normal volume. Like she was speaking to him across a fence. He looked at her. The gun tracked with his gaze, not pointed at her directly, not pointed away, hovering in the space between intention and action. "This is over," she said. "The telegram is sent. The evidence is in this town. You shoot me in the street in Calverton in front of a witness and a federal building, and you confirm everything we've documented about what your family has done." She took another step. "Put it down. You don't—" He stopped. His jaw was working. "You don't understand what this was supposed to be. This was supposed to—" He stopped again. "I know what it was supposed to be," she said. "A railroad corridor and 60,000 acres, and your father's name on all of it." She was close enough now that she could see the specific quality of his distress. Not the cold calculation of his father, but something rawer, more personal, the panic of a man who has run out of road. "He's not going to be able to protect you from this, Preston. Not this." The gun came down. Not dropped, lowered, slowly, in the way of a man who is still processing the fact of his own decision. He lowered it and stood there in the street of Calverton in January, with his father's conspiracy unraveling around him and his 2 hired men sitting on the ground, and he looked like what he was, a young man who had never, not once, been asked to be anything except his father's instrument, and who was only now beginning to understand what that had cost him. Mercer took the gun from his unresisting hand. Meredith turned and walked to the land office door, and Ronan fell in beside her, and she pushed the door open and went inside. The man at the front desk looked up. The office smelled of paper and wood oil, and the particular institutional warmth of a building with good stoves. Through the interior door, she could see a second office, a desk, a lamp burning, a man with his head bent over documents. "Agent Hendricks," she said to the front desk, "tell him Meredith Holloway is here. Tell him she has the evidence Edmund Holloway spent 3 years collecting." The clerk looked at her, at the cut on her cheek, at the state of her coat, at Ronan beside her with the same 4 days of mountain on him. And whatever he saw was sufficient, because he stood up without asking a clarifying question and went directly to the interior door and knocked. She stood in the entrance hall of the Federal Land Office in Calverton, with her coat still on and the packet of copied evidence against her ribs, and her hands that had stopped shaking sometime yesterday and hadn't started again, and she waited. Behind her, through the door, she could hear the sounds of the street settling back into its ordinary rhythms. Mercer's voice, calm and authoritative. Someone responding. The particular quiet that follows an incident when the incident is over. The interior door opened. The man who came out was perhaps 45, plain-faced, with the look of someone who had been doing careful bureaucratic work in difficult territory for long enough that neither careful work nor difficult territory surprised him anymore. He looked at her. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Agent Hendricks," she said. "I received a telegram," he said, "about 10 minutes ago." "I know," she said. "I sent it." He looked at the packet she was already drawing from her coat, at Ronan beside her, at the state of both of them. "Come in," he said. "Tell me everything." She went in, and Ronan came in behind her, and the door closed, and outside the mountains she had just come down from sat white and enormous on the horizon, indifferent as always, keeping no record of anything. The record was here now, in her hands, on a desk, in front of the one man her father had believed could do something with it. She began to talk. She talked for 3 hours. Hendricks was the kind of man who listened the way careful people listen, not filling silences, not nodding to signal understanding before understanding had actually arrived, not performing attention while actually waiting for his turn to speak. He listened and he took notes in a compressed, precise hand, and when he asked questions, they were the questions of someone who already had a framework and was checking where the new information fit inside it. The evidence packet went across his desk, piece by piece. He handled the documents with the deliberate respect of someone who understood what they represented, not just legally, but in terms of what it had cost to produce them. He looked at the land transfer records and cross-referenced them against a ledger he pulled from his own filing cabinet, and the small sound he made when 2 entries matched was not dramatic, just the quiet confirmation of a man finding what he'd been looking for long enough that finding it required a moment of adjustment. Ronan sat in the second chair and said almost nothing. He'd given his statement about his brother and May Derry, dates, the witness account, the names Terrence Holt, and the enforcer from the Ridge whose name they'd gotten from Mercer, who had come in partway through and sat against the wall and contributed 3 pieces of corroborating information from his own investigation without being asked, apparently having made his decision about where his actual interests lay, and settled into it with professional composure. When Meredith finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Hendricks set down his pen. He looked at the papers spread across his desk, at the organized cross-references she'd built into the index her father had designed, at the names and dates and dollar amounts that described 8 years of systematic theft disguised as legal process. "Your father sent me a letter," he said, 14 months ago. It arrived 3 weeks after his death. It had been delayed. There was a problem with the territorial mail route. By the time I received it and began attempting to make contact with anyone in Greymount Valley, I couldn't find a single person willing to speak to me. He paused. I had the letter and no corroboration. I had a framework and no evidence. I've been waiting for someone to come down out of that valley for over a year. Meredith looked at him. He wrote to you before he died. He told me everything he had. He said he was trying to get the original documents to me, but that his health was failing and he wasn't sure he could manage it. He said there was a man in the mountains who had some of the material. Hendricks looked at Ronan briefly. He said if anyone came out of that valley with evidence, it would be his daughter. She sat with that for a moment. Her father's handwriting on a letter she would never see, arriving in a federal office 3 weeks after he was in the ground, doing exactly what he'd designed it to do, even from that distance, even from that silence. He'd trusted her to get here. He just hadn't told her he was trusting her, because telling her would have made her a target before she had the means to protect herself. She had spent 14 months being angry at him for not telling her. She understood now that the anger was correct, and the reason was also correct, and both things could be true, and she was going to have to find a way to hold both of them. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," Hendricks said. "I send telegrams of my own." He sent 5 of them. She didn't see the text of any of them, but she saw him write them, and she noted the recipients: the Territorial Marshal's Office, the Federal Land Administration in the capital, a name she didn't recognize that Hendricks described only as a colleague he trusted, the County Records Office in Calverton, and one that he folded and sealed without reading aloud. He had Preston Voss held at the local marshal's office on the strength of the armed incident outside his building, which gave him 72 hours to work with. He sent Mercer, no longer operating under contract, his client's situation having made the contract effectively void, a legal reality Mercer had already accepted, to accompany a federal deputy back toward Greymount Valley with instructions to arrive at Redstone Crossing before word did. "How long?" Ronan asked. This was the most words he'd said in the last hour. "Before Voss is in custody?" Hendricks considered. "If the marshal's office moves on my authorization tonight and rides hard, they can be in Redstone Crossing by tomorrow evening." He looked at his desk. "Voss is a careful man. If he hears something's coming, he has people in the telegraph office," Meredith said. Hendricks nodded. "Which is why 3 of those telegrams are worded in a way that would tell him nothing useful even if he intercepts them. And why the marshal's party leaves tonight, before anything can filter back through normal channels." She thought about Silas Voss in his office above the town square, silver-haired and certain, with his fur collar and his carefully maintained warmth, and his absolute conviction that the machinery he'd built over 8 years was solid enough to hold whatever pressure came at it. She thought about the way his expression had moved, fractionally, when she'd said railroad in the square. That micro-adjustment, that brief recalibration. He was smart. He was going to feel the ground shift before the deputies arrived. "He'll try to destroy records," she said. "Yes," Hendricks said, "which is why the County Records Office in Redstone Crossing is one of the first stops. We have a copy of everything now. Even if he burns the originals in his office tonight, the copies exist." He looked at her. "Your father understood that. He built redundancy into this specifically to prevent that option from working. Edmund Holloway, who had spent 30 years building something honest in a dishonest valley, had spent 3 of those years quietly, methodically removing every exit from the trap he was building. He hadn't lived to see it close. She was going to have to be enough. They stayed in Calverton 2 more nights while Hendricks assembled his federal case and the territorial marshal organized his party. She and Ronan took a room at the Calverton Hotel. 2 rooms on the same floor, adjacent, and she slept 12 hours the first night and woke feeling not rested exactly, but structurally intact, which was a meaningful improvement. On the second morning, Ronan knocked on her door at 7. She opened it. He was dressed and had clearly been up for a while, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee from the hotel kitchen, one of which he handed to her without asking if she wanted it. "The marshal's party left at midnight," he said. "Hendricks confirmed it this morning." She took the coffee. "And Preston?" "Still held. His father apparently sent a lawyer from Redstone Crossing yesterday, which tells us Voss knows something has shifted, but doesn't yet know how much." He paused. "The lawyer arrived this morning, and Hendricks met with him for 40 minutes. I don't know what was said, but when the lawyer came out, he looked like a man who had just been shown a document he wished he hadn't seen." She thought about Silas Voss receiving that lawyer's report. The careful intelligence, the cold assessment, reading between the lines of what his lawyer was telling him and understanding, not all of it, not yet, but enough. That the machinery had been compromised in a way that couldn't be repaired by the usual methods. "Is he going to run?" she said. "Hendricks thinks not. He's too invested in the valley. His whole identity is built there." Ronan looked at his coffee. "Men like that don't run. They stand and fight even when fighting is over, because running means admitting the thing is lost, and admitting the thing is lost means admitting what the thing was." She looked at him. You know men like that. I was trained by men like that, he said. Different kind, back east. Different machinery, same principle. She thought about him saying things went wrong, and then more things went wrong, sitting at the cabin table the first night while she'd been too tired and too cold to press on it. She still didn't know the full shape of what had happened to him before the mountains, the law practice, whatever it had been, the ways it had compromised him or failed him or both. She suspected she might someday know, and she suspected he would tell her when he decided to, and she was finding, somewhat to her surprise, that she was content to wait for that. There were more immediate things to know. They rode back toward Greymount Valley on the third morning, following the main road this time, in the company of Hendricks and 2 federal deputies. The mountain route was behind them. The East Ridge Traverse, the gully, the ridge shooter tied in the snow, all of it behind them now, and receding into the category of things survived, rather than things happening. The main road was flat and cold, and covered enough miles a day that the familiar outline of the Greymount peaks came into view by mid-afternoon on the second day of riding. She had not expected to feel what she felt at the sight of them, something that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite dread, but contained elements of both. The particular emotional texture of approaching a place that holds everything important and terrible about your life simultaneously. The valley, from the road, looked as it always had. White, still, the timber dark against the snow. The town of Redstone Crossing, a cluster of structures in the distance. Nothing from the outside indicated that anything inside it had changed or was changing. It had changed. They knew this from the rider Hendricks had sent ahead the previous afternoon, who had come back that morning with a report that Meredith had listened to in pieces, fitting them together as they arrived. The marshal's party had reached Redstone Crossing 2 evenings prior. Silas Voss had been in his office, as Hendricks had predicted. Not running, not destroying records, but sitting behind his desk as if the ordinary attitude of authority was itself a defense. He had asked to see the warrant. He had read it. He had said, very calmly, that it was an error, and that he would demonstrate this in court. Then he had allowed himself to be taken into custody, because he understood, even then, even in that moment, that resisting physically was the one error that couldn't be managed afterward. Terrence Holt had been arrested at his residence above the hardware store. He had not been calm. The report described a man who had understood more viscerally than his employer that the thing they'd built was gone, and who had responded to that understanding with a panic that confirmed everything the documents said about him. The Greymount Land and Resource Authority's offices had been sealed. Frightened witnesses were beginning to talk, hesitantly at first, then with the particular release of people who have been holding something inside them at great personal cost for years, and have finally found a context in which releasing it is possible. Margaret Fitch from the dry goods store, Gideon Cole from the livery, both Prentice brothers. A dozen others, names Meredith knew, people who had looked at the ground while she was dragged through the square and who were now looking up, which did not erase what they'd done but was the first step towards something that resembled accountability for everyone, herself included, because she was the one who would have to decide what to do with the knowledge of it. She wasn't ready to make that decision yet. She was willing to be not ready. They rode into Redstone Crossing in the early afternoon. It was different and not different. The same buildings, the same street, the same winter light on the same frozen mud in the same square. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was not the silence of deliberate not looking anymore. It was the silence of a place in the early stages of reckoning with itself, which is a messier and more uncomfortable silence than the one it replaced. People looked at her. Margaret Fitch came out of the dry goods store when she heard the horses and stood on the boardwalk and looked at Meredith directly and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "I owe you an apology." Meredith stopped her horse, looked at Margaret, 63 years old, a woman she'd known her whole life, who had given her peppermint sticks and who had looked at the ground. "Yes," Meredith said, "you do." She didn't soften it. She wasn't going to soften it, not yet, not on the first day back, but she also didn't push past it, didn't refuse it, or make it larger than it was. "I'd like to hear it sometime," she said, "when you're ready to mean it." Margaret Fitch nodded once, slowly, and Meredith rode on. Hendricks went directly to the marshal's office to review the custody situation. She let Ronan handle the horses at the livery. Gideon Cole, for his part, took both animals without comment and asked no questions except about the gray's leg, which he examined with professional attention and declared bruised but not seriously compromised. And she walked to the town square alone. It was empty. The chains were gone, obviously. They'd never been permanent fixtures, just tools deployed for a specific purpose and then put away. The mud had refrozen, and the snow had partially filled the depression where her face had been pressed into the ground 8 days ago. Nothing marked it. There was no visible evidence that anything had happened there. That was the thing about corruption that she'd been turning over in her mind since the cabin. The way it doesn't announce itself. It looks like ordinary ground. It looks like proper legal procedure, like debt collection and property transfer and the normal operations of municipal authority. The chains had been real chains. The mud had been real mud. But what had put her there was paperwork. Systematic, patient, legitimate-seeming paperwork built over 8 years by a careful man who understood that the best way to steal something was to make the theft look like administration. Her father had understood that too, which was why he'd fought it with its own tools, documents, records, the same patient accumulation of evidence, the same trust in paperwork as a weapon. She stood in the square and looked at the courthouse steps where Silas Voss had stood with his fur collar and his careful warmth and said, sees her with the same tone of voice he probably used to order lunch, and she felt the complexity of what was actually true pressing down on her from multiple directions at once. She was alive. The evidence had reached Hendricks. Voss was in custody. The machinery had been stopped. None of this had been clean. None of it had happened the way anyone planned. Ronan's brother and May Derry were still dead, and that fact was not altered by Holt's arrest or the reopening of their case or the official acknowledgement that what happened to them had been murder rather than accident. The Dunmore family, wherever they'd ended up after being pushed off their land, was not automatically restored by the collapse of the land authority. The Carvers, the others whose names appeared in the transfer records, justice. And she'd been thinking carefully about this word since Calverton, turning it over, testing its edges. Justice was not the same thing as reversal. You couldn't reverse what had been done. You could stop more of it from happening. You could hold the people who did it accountable. You could work to restore what could be restored and acknowledge honestly what couldn't. That was the actual shape of what was available, and she was finding that accepting the actual shape, instead of waiting for a better shape that wasn't coming, was its own kind of necessary work. Ronan found her there. He came across the square and stood beside her without announcing himself, which she'd come to expect. He had the particular quality of arriving in spaces without disturbing them. The marshal's office confirmed Holt is talking, he said. He's naming other people in exchange for consideration on his charges. There are more people connected to this than the record showed. Does it surprise you? No. He was looking at the courthouse steps. Schemes that size always have more connections than they appear to. The center is visible eventually. The edges take longer. She looked at him. Caleb's case. Formally reopened as of this morning. Hendricks said the marshal will take a statement from the Ridge man, the one we tied up, as part of his own process. He's been cooperative since Calverton. A pause. It's not a trial. It might not lead to one, depending on what they can prove beyond Holt's testimony, but it's a record. An official record that says what happened to them was not what the original report said it was. She watched his face while he said this. He was looking at the courthouse steps, and his expression had the quality it sometimes had. Controlled, contained, the internal debate happening behind the surface rather than on it. But there was something different underneath today. Something that didn't resolve cleanly into any one feeling, which she thought was probably the accurate emotional response to this particular development. Acknowledgement was not resolution. The official record would say what happened. It would not undo it. He knew that. And she knew he knew it, and they stood together in the square in the cold, and she didn't say anything that tried to make it better than it was. After a while, he said, I need to go back to the cabin. I know, she said. The originals are under the floor. Hendricks needs them. The copies were sufficient to move on, but the originals are necessary for the full legal case. When are you going? Tomorrow morning, probably. The passes are still manageable. A pause. I'll be back in 4 days. She looked at him. I'll have the east fence line started by the time you get back. He looked at her. The ranch, she said. There's an east fence line that's been sagging since October. I've been putting it off. She met his gaze. Come back. It was not a small thing she was asking. She understood that. He'd lived alone in those mountains for 6 years, and whatever the mountains had been for him, refuge, penance, the particular piece of a place that made no demands on who you'd been before you arrived in it, they had been enough. She was asking him to consider whether enough was still sufficient. He looked at her for a long moment with those assessment eyes that she had learned over 8 days of extreme circumstances to read more accurately than she'd initially thought possible. 4 days, he said. She nodded. I'll have the post ready. He left the following morning, early, in the way he did most things, without ceremony, just present and then moving. She watched him ride north from the ranch yard, and then she turned and went back to work, because there was work to do, and because watching someone ride away until they disappeared over the horizon was the kind of thing that required an emotional investment she was saving for something she hadn't named yet. The ranch was in worse condition than she'd let herself fully assess while she was managing the crisis of simply keeping it. The east fence was the worst, but not the only problem. The south pasture gate had been hanging wrong for months. The barn roof had a section that had taken on too much snow weight and developed a sag that needed addressing before spring thaw, and the 2 heifers that had been close to delivering when she left had both delivered in her absence, one successfully and one not, and the surviving calf needed attention she hadn't been there to give. She gave it now. There was something clarifying about this kind of work, she found. Not healing exactly, nothing so simple, but clarifying. The fence post went into the ground, or it didn't. The calf took the supplemental feed, or it was going to need a different approach. The barn roof needed bracing from inside before it needed patching from outside, and understanding this required examining the actual structure rather than making assumptions about what it probably needed from the ground. Every problem had a specific nature that revealed itself through direct engagement, and the direct engagement was what she had, and she found she was, against all reasonable expectation, grateful for it. She had visitors. This she had not anticipated fully. On the second day back, both Prentice brothers came to the fence line where she was working and offered labor without preamble, not as apology, or not articulated as apology, but she understood the grammar of it. She said yes. They worked alongside her for 3 hours, and at the end of it, Amos Prentice, the older one, said, "We should have done more when they took you in the square." He stopped. "I want you to know that I know that." She drove a fence post into the frozen ground and said, "Tell me about what's been happening to your family's south pasture. Hendricks needs to know which properties experienced actual interference and which ones were threatened but not acted on yet." Amos looked at her. "You're not going to—" "I'm asking you about your pasture," she said, "because I need the information and because Hendricks needs it, and because your experience is part of this case." She looked at him steadily. "We can have the other conversation later, when we've both had more time." He nodded. He told her about the south pasture. On the third day, Margaret Fitch came with a covered dish that contained a beef pie still warm from the oven, and she set it on the porch without being invited in and said, "I know this doesn't fix it. I want you to know that I'm not trying to fix it with a pie." She paused. "I'm trying to acknowledge it, that there's a difference between being frightened and being cowardly, and I've been telling myself for 8 days that I was only frightened, and the truth is, it was both." Meredith stood in her doorway and looked at this woman she'd known her entire life. "Thank you for that," she said. "Come in if you want. I was about to make coffee." Margaret came in. She was not going to be simple about the forgiveness. She was not going to perform it or rush it or let other people's need for the discomfort to be over accelerate her past the actual work of it. But she was also not going to withhold it indefinitely as a form of punishment, because she'd been thinking about what punishment actually accomplished when the thing being punished was fear. And what she'd concluded was that fear punished was fear that went underground, rather than fear that became something more useful. The valley was going to need people who could make better choices next time. You didn't produce those people by making them feel irredeemably guilty about the last time. You produced them, insofar as it was possible to produce them at all, by creating the conditions in which they could see clearly what the last time had cost themselves, their neighbors, the people they'd looked away from, and by offering a path that wasn't self-justification, but also wasn't permanent condemnation. That was complicated. It was going to stay complicated. She wasn't going to sort it out over beef pie and coffee, and she didn't try. Ronan came back on the 4th day, as promised, in the early afternoon. She was on the fence line, The east section was two-thirds done, which was better progress than she'd expected given the frozen ground. When she heard the horse and looked up and saw him coming across the north pasture with the saddlebag that contained the originals, intact, still wrapped in oilskin, pulled from under the cabin floor exactly as he'd left them. He dismounted at the fence line and tied the horse and looked at the work. "You got the posts in," he said. Told you I would." He picked up the end of the wire she hadn't stretched yet and held it at the right tension without being asked, and she used the stretcher to set it, and they worked together along the remaining section without discussing it, finding a rhythm that required almost no communication because the work itself communicated what was needed. When they finished, they stood at the corner post in the cold afternoon light and looked at the fence, straight, correctly tensioned, properly anchored. And she thought, this is what recovery actually looks like. Not a moment of triumph, not a clean resolution, just two people standing at a functional fence in January, cold and tired, with an enormous amount of work still ahead. "The cabin," he said. "I need to go back up to close it properly before spring. Check the foundation, seal the chimney." A pause. "It'll keep." "It'll keep," she said. He looked at the mountains, north, up past the valley, the gray mount peaks white and permanent against the winter sky. She watched him look at them, watched the specific quality of his attention to them, which was neither longing nor indifference. It was the look of a person taking accurate inventory of where something stands. "You should know," he said, "that I'm not particularly easy to work with. I have habits. I do things in a specific order, and I don't like deviation from the order. I don't talk enough in the mornings, and I talk too directly the rest of the time, which some people find unkind." "I've noticed both of those things," she said. "I'm telling you because you're offering a partnership, and you should know what the partnership actually contains." She looked at him. "You should know that I'm running a ranch that's in worse shape than I've told anyone, including myself, for the past 14 months. I have debt that's real, unlike the debt they invented, and I have work that's going to take years, and there's a significant chance that I spend 2 more winters being barely solvent before the operation is stable enough to breathe normally. I'm telling you because you should know what you're walking into." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been living on what I trapped and what I stored," he said. "I don't have much, but I have some, and I don't have expenses. I'm not asking for your money. I know, I'm telling you what I'm bringing." She looked at the fence they'd just built, at the mountains, at the ranch that had been her father's and was hers now, scarred and stretched thin and still standing. "The east fence line is done," she said. "The south gate needs replacing. The barn roof needs bracing before thaw." She looked at him. "Do you know how to brace a barn roof?" "Yes," he said. "Then let's start there." They walked back toward the barn together, and the light was doing what January light does in the early afternoon, going low and gold at the edges, cutting sideways across the snow. And the ranch around them was quiet in the way of a place that has been through something and is now in the early stages of becoming itself again on the other side of it. She thought about what her father had built here and what had been taken from it, and what she was going to build in its place, which would not be the same thing and was not supposed to be. She was not her father. Ronan was not her father either, and she was not going to need him to be. She thought about the valley, the families whose land was being reviewed, the restoration process Hendricks had described as slow and imperfect and dependent on documentation that in some cases no longer existed and in others was now in federal hands. The Dunmores might come back. The Carvers probably wouldn't. They'd built something new somewhere else, and the disruption of returning was its own cost. Some of what was lost was going to stay lost, and the work of accepting that without letting it collapse into bitterness was going to be ongoing, daily, not a thing you completed once and then had done. She understood something now that she hadn't entirely before the square and the mountains and the cabin and the East Ridge and Calverton and the conversation with Hendricks and the beef pie and the fence. Courage. The word got used in stories as if it were a quality some people possessed and others didn't, a characteristic like eye color, fixed and inherent. She'd found that it wasn't like that. It was more like the fence post. It went into the ground because you put it there, because you drove it into frozen earth 1 foot at a time until it was set. And it stayed because the ground held it. And the ground held it because the work had been done correctly. And the work being done correctly required starting it, even when the ground was too hard, and you weren't sure it would hold. Every person in Redstone Crossing who had looked at the ground in that square had possessed the same capacity she had. The difference was not capacity. The difference was the moment of decision and what you let determine it. Fear was a reasonable response to Silas Voss. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when the anger had been fresher. Fear was accurate information about the cost of opposition. What mattered was what you did with accurate information, whether you let it tell you what was possible or whether you let it tell you only what was safe. Her father had chosen possible over safe, quietly, for 3 years, alone, sick, without telling anyone. She was choosing it now, openly, in daylight, with a partner who talked too directly and had habits he was upfront about, and a valley full of people who were in the early stages of choosing it themselves, imperfectly and inconsistently, one fence post and one apology and one open door at a time. The barn roof needed bracing before thaw. That was enough to start with. She pushed open the barn door and the warmth of the animals met her, and behind her she heard Ronan's footfall and the particular creak of the door that she'd been meaning to fix since November. And she said, "I'll hold the support beam. You tell me where you want the brace positioned." He looked at the roof structure for 30 seconds. Precise, systematic, reading the problem the way he read everything. "There," he said, "and there. The sag is secondary. There's a weakened joint at the main rafter that's the actual issue. Fix that first and the sag corrects itself." She looked at the joint he was indicating. He was right. "All right," she said, "let's fix it." Outside, the valley lay white and cold and imperfect, and beginning, in its fractured and uneven way, to be something better than it had been. Not transformed, not healed, not fixed, not set right as if the 8 years hadn't happened. Just better. Moving, incrementally and with difficulty, in the right direction. The mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent to outcomes, keeping their own time. Inside the barn, 2 people who had survived something difficult set about the ordinary, necessary work of building what came next. That was the whole of it. That was enough.